Dr. Ashok Malhotra. I'm the chairman of the Society for Yoga and Meditation at SUNY Oneonta. This is the third speaker in our series of speakers for the academic year 2004-2005. I'm delighted that we have our speaker here. His name is Mr. Leonard PerlMutter, who is the president of American Meditation Institute near Albany, New York. And he will be with us today to speak about who am I and its connection to yoga and the purpose of yoga and meditation. And along with Dr. PerlMutter, or Mr. PerlMutter, we had Dr. Douglas Schrader, who is the chairman of the philosophy department and also a distinguished teaching professor at SUNY Oneonta. And between three of us, we're going to have 28 to 30 minutes of good discussion. So I'm very happy that both of you are here. And we want to ask you first about the topic which you have chosen to speak about. And the topic is, who am I? And how is it connected to yoga and its purpose or its goal? Could you say something about it, please?
First, I'd like to thank you for the invitation to be here today. The question, the philosophical question, who am I, is important and has been important in every tradition. In yoga, the question, who am I, brings a person back to an understanding of their essential nature. What is very interesting is every person throughout the day is constantly taking actions, speaking words and thinking thoughts. And we learned in 4th or 5th grade that for every action there is an equal reaction. So every action we take has a consequence. And what the sages of yoga science learned many thousands of years ago was, if we did not know who we are on the highest level of consciousness, in other words, if we constantly identify with our body, with our mind, with our thoughts, desires, emotions, or even the suggestion and tide of our own culture, then the majority of the actions that we take are based on the power of the unconscious mind. And what is stored in the unconscious mind are things that we are attached to, things that we worry about, things that we resent, unfulfilled desires. The problem for the human being is, by identifying with the body and the mind and the culture exclusively, the majority of those actions bring about physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual dis-ease. On the other hand, if we earnestly ask the question of ourselves, who am I? Slowly, slowly, the answer comes. With that answer, we also access an intuitive library of wisdom within us that will suggest to us every moment of every day what is the appropriate thought to think, what is the appropriate word to speak, and which is the appropriate action to take that will lead us for our highest and greatest good.
Now, when you say that human beings, according to yoga, have this library of information, library of wisdom, this reminds me of the famous Western philosopher Socrates, who said that we are here to know ourselves. Know thyself. That's the maxim. And all knowledge is within the human being. And in order to get this knowledge out, to dribble it out, shoot it out, we need to inquire constantly. So his method of getting this information, wisdom out, was through a dialogue, through inquiring constantly. And through inquiry, he thought that this dialogue will give birth to truth, which lies embedded in human beings. You see a kind of similarity here between what yoga philosophers are trying to do, or yoga thinkers are trying to do, and offering what you call the contemplative practice or the meditation. Is meditation their way of inquiry to get into this library within?
Yes, I would say that they're virtually one and the same. In yoga science, we are talking about an internal perspective. We are going within, seeking within, finding that truth within. So this dialogue that takes place is all an internal dialogue. And what the sages of yoga science have discovered was that each of us are actually citizens of two worlds. We are the citizen of the outer world that we're most familiar with, the body, the mind, the senses, and the physical world, but we are also a citizen of the subtle world, what is referred to in early Christian tradition as heaven, the subtle world, the world of consciousness. And since we are citizens of two worlds, what these ancient yoga masters, women and men, who practiced for many, many years, what they discovered was, if our outer actions can be based upon our inner wisdom, based on the unerring wisdom of the superconscious mind, the same portion of the mind where Albert Einstein discovered the mathematical equations, and where Paul McCartney hears beautiful melodies, and the monarch butterfly receives flying instructions from Oneonta to Mexico. If we can tap in to that superconscious mind and use that wisdom to base our outer actions, the promise is we will become happy and healthy and creative and productive and artistic and loving and nurtured to the fullest extent possible. And this superconscious mind is not some figment of our imagination. We have access to it 24 hours a day. In the West, we refer to it as conscience. In the ancient Christian tradition, it's referred to as the Holy Spirit or Holy Ghost. Interestingly, the word conscience, coming from the Latin, with science. If we can base our outer actions on science, in this case yoga science, then the promise is our lives will become poetry and song.
That's very nice. I think Dr. Sher might have a question for you.
Leonard, you speak of being citizens of two worlds, and intriguingly compare the world of the mind with heaven. And as a philosopher, my mind is drawn immediately to the work of the individual we know as St. Augustine in the 5th century. Augustine wrote his most famous work titled City of God, City of Man, in response to the sack of Rome by Alaric the Goth in 410. There were a number of people who complained that Rome had become too Christian, that they had turned the other cheek when they should have thrust the other sword. And in responding to that, Augustine ends up developing the idea that we all have to choose between two residencies. That is, we cannot be citizens of both the celestial and the terrestrial world. And although you've used some similar language, I suspect that yours is not the dichotomous residency of Augustine. So I wonder if you'd speak a little more to the similarities or differences between what you find in your views and what many Americans who are of a Christian background, particularly Catholic, and have learned Augustine's work might think of.
Well, I think that we differ insofar as what yoga science is asking of us is to recognize, first of all, that we are citizens of two worlds, and to live in this world, but not necessarily be of this world. We have to take actions. We have all these duties and responsibilities that require action that will bring about consequence. So if we can use our inner wisdom, our highest wisdom, tapping into that superconscious mind to base our outer actions, to live in the world and fulfill all of our duties and responsibilities, then the promise is that we will be led for our highest and greatest good. You mentioned something about the mind being equated to heaven. Yoga science has a little bit of a different take on that, insofar as the mind, which is our most powerful instrument, is actually what is separating us from heaven. Our bundle of habit patterns of the mind is what is separating us from the perfection. And yet we recognize that the mind moves first and the body follows. So we cannot even raise our hand without first entertaining a thought. So what yoga provides us is a blueprint, or a framework, if you will, for using the mind to go beyond the mind. Yeah. We use the mind and the different functions of the mind, and one of the functions of the mind happens to be the conscience. The conscience, one of the major functions of the mind, is analogous to a mirror. And if it's purified and used regularly, this mirror will be polished so that it can accurately reflect wisdom from the center of consciousness, which is actually beyond the mind. So therefore, through experimentation, through yoga science, we We use the mind and the functions of the mind to go beyond the mind to access wisdom from the center of consciousness, take that wisdom from the center of consciousness and turn it into our thoughts, our words, and our actions. So we actually become one with the Father in heaven, so to speak, because the Father is in heaven, whereas we find ourselves in this limited form of the human being in the material world.
Right.
Now, since you mentioned earlier the word superconscious, and that's the source of all this creativity, all this inspiration, which the mathematician could get or any human being can get. Also, you're talking about yoga science. So how do you see the connection between yoga science and talking about superconscious, which most of the scientists will say, no, there's no such thing. And how do you connect these, and how does yoga connect these two?
Yoga, in Sanskrit, means union. It is the union of the outer action with the inner wisdom.
Okay.
So yoga creates experiments to determine, what am I going to think? We have free will, so we can think whatever we want to, or whatever we desire. We can choose which desires we serve. We can say whatever we want and serve whatever desires we have for certain speech. And we can take physical actions based on whatever desires we have. But not every desire is necessarily good for us.
Okay. Yeah,
And many things that are pleasant
Right.
are not good, and yet some things that are good are not pleasant. So for the human being to experience true happiness and true freedom, what we are being asked to do through the experimental process of yoga is to be willing to discipline our habit for the sake of the experiment. So if I think a thought that comes into my awareness that evokes fear, and my conscience, for example, tells me that, gee, I've done everything to prepare for an examination, I've studied, and yet I have a habit of worrying unnecessarily. So in that case, my continued attention to that thought that evokes worry or fear is going to be debilitating to me, because the hormones are going to surge, the adrenaline is going to surge, it's going to pollute my internal environment, and the one that is going to be injured is going to be me.
Right.
If, however, I can listen to my inner wisdom that is telling me that this thought is not leading me for my highest and greatest good, and if I can then take that thought willingly and consciously and sacrifice it by withdrawing my attention from it, the inherent contractive force of fear, through the act of sacrifice, will transform that power into strategic reserves of energy, willpower, and creativity that are then banked in 3 bank accounts that have my name on it. Energy cannot be created nor destroyed, but it can be transformed. And the experimental process of yoga science asks us to sacrifice. In other words, it is in giving that you receive. If you give up something of value, like the ground upon which you stand, your fears, your anger, your selfish desires, that only bring pain and unhappiness to you, if you can sacrifice them and give them up and renounce them, their inherent power is transformed into energy, willpower, and creativity. Then, when you come face to face with another duty and responsibility that demands a lot of energy, a lot of willpower, and a lot of creativity, well, you have all the requisites for a successful relationship.
Yeah, you also mentioned earlier the superconscious. I come back to in yoga. Superconscious is identified with your real self, your true self. And the 3 terms which yoga uses, or other Hindu systems of thought use, are Sat, Chit, Ananda. And they constitute the core of a human being. That's where the delight lies. That's where knowledge lies. That's where immortality lies. Could you just connect that to how American Constitution works? Or what are the different things we have, the way people guide their lives in America? There is a kind of practical thing, even though people don't know. But there is a connection, and I think you can form that connection.
Yes. Well, you are correct. What the sages from all traditions tell us in different words is that essentially we are each of us are spirit having a human experience. We are not humans having a spiritual experience. We are spirit having a human experience. And the nature of that spirit has three basic components. The first is Sat, which means eternal, never born, never dies. It is self-existent, not dependent on anything else for its existence. The coat I am wearing is not considered Sat. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It is not self-existent. It is dependent on many things, the sheep for the wool, and the manufacturer, and the trucker, and the store that sold me this item. And eventually, this coat will be destroyed and will no longer exist.
Right.
So the first characteristic of our essential nature is Sat, eternal.
Okay.
And that's a head-scratcher for most of us because everything that we can perceive has a beginning, a middle, and an end.
Right, right.
And the second characteristic that you appropriately mentioned is Chit. Chit has two characteristics, and that is consciousness and wisdom,
Okay.
awareness, the capacity that each of us has to witness whatever might appear. And part of that consciousness, within that consciousness, lies an intuitive library of knowledge, the superconscious mind, that is unerring in its perfection, that can always tell the human being what to think, what to say, and how to act in ways that will lead us for our highest and greatest good. The third characteristic, Anand, or bliss, or fullness and contentment. It is the nature of consciousness, this eternal consciousness, to be blissful and full. So Sat, Chit, Anand, eternal consciousness, wisdom, and bliss, is our essential nature. Through the human being, the Sat, Chit, and Anand, eternal consciousness, wisdom, and bliss, expresses itself by our three deepest driving desires. So the eternal aspect of that spirit expresses itself through the human being by our shared deep driving desire for life. I want to live. I don't want to be sick. I don't want to die.
Okay.
The second characteristic of our essential nature, which is Chit, consciousness and wisdom, expresses itself by our shared deep driving desire for liberty. Liberty or freedom. The liberty or freedom that comes from knowing something or to know something.
Right.
And the third characteristic of our essential nature, Anand, bliss or fullness, expresses itself through the human being by our shared deep driving desire to be happy. I just want to be happy. So for the human being, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness has a very important and a familiar ring, because life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all people are created equal, endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, the right of life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. So when the framers of the Declaration of Independence wrote those words down, were they talking just in poetic terms, or was this a divinely inspired document? Yoga science would say this was a divinely inspired document because life, liberty, and happiness cannot be alienated from us, cannot be separated from us, because on the highest level of consciousness, life, liberty, and happiness is us having a human experience.
That's what constitutes the essence of ourself.
That's right.
That's our true self.
That is our true self, life, liberty, and happiness.
Dr. Schrader might have a question for you.
You speak of these as fundamental desires, and in explaining superconsciousness earlier, you spoke briefly about desire and choosing desires. I certainly encounter many students, many people here in America who come to believe that they don't have any choice over their desires, that desires are something that sort of happen to them. They either happen because they're innate and instinctual, or they happen because of the efforts of Fifth Avenue marketers or whatever. And even though they might buy the principle of actions and reactions, it seems to them that they really have no out, because if their actions stem from desires over which they have no control, to what extent do they have control over themselves and their actions? So if you could come back to desire and expand on that, I think it would be helpful to them.
Desire is very, very, very important. Some desires are helpful and some are not helpful. And it centers down to each individual's understanding of what their purpose is and what is their deepest driving desire. Because what the sages tell us is, we are our deepest driving desire. As our deepest driving desire is, so is our will.
Yes.
As our will is, so is our deed. As our deed is, so becomes our destiny. So even though we have no control over what comes to us, what the sages tell us and teach us is, we always have control over what our reaction is to what comes. So what the ancient sages of yoga science tell us is, the actions that we take are represented by 3 different types of arrows. The first arrow has already been shot from our bow.
Yes.
And that arrow is on its way and will be coming back. We will reap the fruit of that action that has already been taken in the past. The second arrow that I have is the arrow which is currently, in the present moment, drawn in my bow. Now I have control over this arrow and where it goes and its flight.
Right.
The third type of arrow are represented by all of the arrows that are in my quiver,
Yes.
that are on my back, future arrows that I can pull out at any time that I need to take an action. So the question is, am I going to serve a particular desire simply because it is a suggestion? And what yoga science asks us to do is to serve only those desires that have the good housekeeping seal of approval of the superconscious mind.
Yeah.
And sacrifice those desires that do not have the good housekeeping seal of approval. However, simply by giving up a desire does not mean that you lose anything. By giving up a desire that does not have the good housekeeping seal of approval, its inherent power is transformed into energy, willpower, and creativity that can be used later on. So meditation and yoga science is really a combination of banking, conservation, and ecology, all on the subtle level.
Right.
That teaches us how to unify all of our desires in service to that deepest driving desire.
And that brings us back very naturally to where the conversation began with the principle that students learn in the 4th grade of for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. That itself a statement of Galilean and Newtonian mechanics for inanimate objects which have absolutely no choice whatsoever over what the actions are or what the reactions are going to be. In fact, it's that science deliberately designed to be objective rather than subjective, so that there is no room for consciousness. There is no room for desire. It's not that the billiard ball desires to move off, simply that this is a natural consequence of action and reaction. The principle of action and reaction very often, when we look at it in terms of Hinduism or Buddhism, is called karma. And many people think of that as a connection between lifespans. But from listening to you, your notion is really a third thing. It's not so much the connection between lives necessarily as it is within this life. That what we're now experiencing is a function of what we have done. What we will experience is a function of what we are doing.
Yeah, I have a difficult enough time dealing with what I have to deal with in this lifetime. I don't know about Shirley MacLaine, but as far as I'm concerned,
she goes on a limb.
but as far as I'm concerned, I have enough to deal with right here,
Yeah,
and
right.
I want to get it right.
Yeah.
And the fact that we have the body, that we have this mind, that we have these limitations, these fears, and these resentments, and these notions of self-willed desire, means that we have some stuff to work out. One of my favorite movies is Groundhog Day, which clearly illustrates that law of
Doing
karma.
the same thing again.
You do it again and again until you get it right.
Yeah.
Until you get it right.
Well, that's also the similar kind of idea in Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the eternal recurrence, that what has happened in the past will be repeating it again and again.
Yes.
Next generation is going to repeat it.
That's
Well, let me go back to the way I understood Hinduism and its connection to yoga. And I'll give a quick kind of summary of it. That the belief which I was taught by my philosopher teachers was that before anything was, there was consciousness, infinite consciousness, abstract consciousness, which made itself concrete through the sound Om. And that was the first cosmic vibration, and everything else in the universe came out of it. And then that created the space, that created the galaxy, that created the earth, the sun, and human beings. And the core of each human being resides that same consciousness, which you call conscience, which we could even call superconscience or super consciousness, that is there. And through meditation, you and I are here to reach that part, develop that part, so you can go beyond our ordinary mind to that conscience. And at different times of the day or night or at any time, when you're really dedicated to meditation, taking that inward journey, you can actually get in touch with your conscience beyond your ordinary mind. And that conscience will get in touch with the universal consciousness. And that's your inspiration. That's your creativity.
That's your genius.
And that's your genius. And that's what meditation will try to do, teach you those steps to get in touch and tap on that source, yes, which is inside you.
Yes, and meditation is the focus of mental energy down to a point. And in that point, similar to particle physics or the way energy comes down on an atom to create a nuclear explosion, in meditation we focus the mind down to a point, what is referred to as the bindu, and, yes, and when we can burst through that bindu, a great explosion of creativity just comes into our awareness.
Since we have just a couple of minutes left, I just want to ask you to tell us why so many people in the West, and especially in America, more than 10 million people, are practicing meditation or yoga of some kind.
Well, I would say that meditators are pleasure seekers.
They're pleasure. Are
Yes.
they narcissistic?
No, it is a pleasure. It makes you feel better physically,
Right.
mentally,
Yeah.
emotionally. It gives you more energy, it gives you more focus, and it gives you more creativity. It gives you the skill to deal with whatever comes.
Well, that's great. Dr. Sher, we have one more minute. I want to thank you for being part of this panel.
Thank you.
To ask Mr. PerlMutter these wonderful questions. And I want to thank you, Leonard, for being with us at SUNY Oneonta campus to be our wonderful speaker, where you're going to enlighten us, and you have enlightened us. And we are here as pleasure seekers. And I thank you both.
And we thank you for organizing
Thank
this.
you very much.
And I thank the Meta-Nexus Institute as well as SUNY Oneonta for funding this project. Thank you.
Thank you.